to the area where Powhatan was at that point living. And it's very hard to understand exactly what happened. We know that Smith was put through a long period, several days, of kind of religious ceremonies. And he talks about the priests coming and drawing circles in the ground and putting corn around the circles and doing all kinds of religious ceremonies, which of course he didn't understand. He thought they were preparing to execute him. And so then, after all of these religious ceremonies, he's then taken into Powhatan's presence. And there's this episode where his head is placed on a rock. He thinks that a priest is approaching him with a cudgel to beat out his brains on this rock, and Pocahontas comes and lays her head on top of his.
Pocahontas was the daughter of Powhatan, who was the paramount chief of the Algonquin tribes in the vicinity of Jamestown. And she was, by contemporary accounts, his favorite daughter. But she was only 11 years old when she met Captain John Smith. So certainly the Disney film version, which holds that she was an attractive teenage girl drawn to an attractive young John Smith, doesn't work at either end, because John Smith was quite a mature man with a bushy beard, and she was a girl who wasn't even a teenager yet.
In reality, historians have drawn the conclusion that what actually happened is that John Smith was probably going through some type of adoption process. You know, it was some type of ritual, some kind of ceremony in which he was being adopted so that he could become an ally of the Indians.
The goal of the ceremony was to render subordinate Smith and the colonists so that they would take orders in the future from Powhatan. Now, of course, John Smith misunderstood this whole ceremony.
When Smith recounted his meeting with Pocahontas when she was in England as the Lady Rebecca, the wife of John Rolfe, he says that she called him father, which again I think tends to reinforce the notion that this was an adoption ceremony in which that's the role in which he was being adopted.
By 1616, the Virginia Company had transported more than 1,700 people to the Chesapeake and spent well over 50,000 pounds doing it, an immense amount of money for that century. Yet all they had to show for it was an unprofitable town inhabited by 350 diseased colonists. To stimulate immigration by propertied men, the company also introduced a concept called the headright system.
So the idea of the headright system was that for every servant you brought over or whose way you paid, you got 50 acres in Virginia. And servants also, because servants were said to be adventurers in person, you could be an adventurer in purse or in person, and a servant was an adventurer in person because he adventured or she adventured him or herself. They also were promised in the early years land when their term of servitude was up, and that was a lure that was beyond imagining because none of those people would ever have become landowners in England.
As private property owners rather than company employees, the colonists showed more initiative to grow their own crops.
And so after about a decade, they begin to hit on the right answer. And the answer that they hit on is the one that Sir Walter Raleigh actually had already come up with. So they do several things at the end of between 1618 and 1620. And what it all boils down to is that they realize that the way to get people to function is to allow them essentially to work for themselves. So they set up a system whereby property ownership becomes widespread. They give people an assembly. Purpose of the assembly is basically to decide on taxation for road building and fortifications and that kind of thing. And they remove the professional military men and put a citizen militia in its place. And it turns out that once you start doing those three things, colonies tend to work.
Secondly, in 1616, led by John Rolfe, the planters began to learn how to raise tobacco. King James at first made this statement about smoking.
It is a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs.
How right he was, but he soon learned to love the money England earned from tobacco. In 1638, 3 million pounds of tobacco was shipped from Virginia to England.
Tobacco was Virginia's gold. But once they began to plant tobacco, which coincided with the campaign to bring over large numbers of settlers, then actually Virginia became a thriving colony.
As tobacco plantations grew, the planters needed more land that came to them at the expense of the Indians' need for land. Having lost almost all their land, the Indians were confined on small reservations surrounded by colonial settlements. Disease and war reduced the Algonquin population from 24,000 in 1607, when the settlers arrived, to only 2,000 by 1669. The reduced Indian danger, the increased supply of farmland, and the profits of tobacco cultivation combined to attract growing thousands of immigrants from England. Emigration from England to Virginia more than doubled by the 1660s. Peoples from other European countries began to migrate to North America in the 17th century. The English had settled the Chesapeake beginning in 1607 and New England beginning in 1620. But the English neglected the mid-Atlantic coast between the two regions. This neglect enabled the Dutch and the Swedes to establish a foothold. Henry Hudson, the great Dutch explorer, in 1609 blazed the trail up the waterway named for him, the Hudson River, to trade for furs with the Indians. The Dutch West India Company, which funded these excursions, realized it was important to protect the mouth of this crucial waterway. In 1625, the Dutch established a permanent settlement at the mouth of the Hudson. They named it New Amsterdam. Then the area was farmland. Cattle and crops from these farms helped supply food for slaves in Dutch West Indies islands. Immigrants from Sweden settled in the Delaware Valley. Not surprisingly, they called the region New Sweden. While the English had plans to make all of the eastern seaboard of North America theirs, they tolerated the Dutch and Swedes for the time being. Both the Dutch and the Swedes were fellow Protestants, and they were allies with the English in the European wars of religion. It should be understood that the Dutch were economic and military giants in the 17th century.
I think they become so powerful and important because they're the first people to understand that information is a commodity that can be transferred just like any other. You know, they're in that sense very modern, and I think it's fitting that it should be New York that's their settlement, because New York is the center of, you know, the sort of tech transfer universe that we live in.
The Dutch colony of New Netherlands was short-lived, however. Before the end of the 17th century, Dutch territory became the property of the English. But why did the Dutch colonization fail?
I would put it, you know, I would say the Dutch figured out that they don't need colonies to do what they want to do. Because the Dutch are the great economic power of the 17th century. And that colonization is not necessary to what they're doing. That they're involved in global trade, and that's a different sort of enterprise.
In 1664, the English determined to eliminate non-English colonies that lay between New England and the Chesapeake colonies. 3 English warships with 300 soldiers commanded by Colonel Richard Nichols, surprised the unsuspecting Dutch. Threatened with destruction, the enraged Governor Stuyvesant was forced to surrender New Amsterdam. A smaller force took the Delaware Valley. In a 1667 peace treaty, the Dutch turned over all their lands to England. New Netherlands became New York State. New Amsterdam became New York City, and Fort Orange became Albany. In other programs in this series, we'll explore the other early settlements of the English, the French, and the Spanish, and discover more about the birth and the earliest formative years of our nation.